Hey guys, it's Balfam here, and as per usual, it hasn't been that long since my last Valkyrie investment guide, but so much has changed that I believe that it's worth making a new one. And just for the usual disclaimer, once again, no Valkyrie investment guide actually lasts for that long. Please do keep in mind the date that this was uploaded, and just like my past investment guides, I've completely yoinked this format off of the Keepster. Please don't let him know, because I don't want him to unfriend me on Honkai Star Rail. Now let me make it very clear first of all that if you're a new player, you should generally always skip old Valkyries and only pull new upcoming Valkyries. Basically, I'd only consider pulling old Valkyries if you have an excess amount of crystals. And please only pull Valkyries if you can actually get the weapon too. And one more thing, if you're truly interested in getting competitive in this game, then unfortunately you can't just choose one really strong team and brute force every single mode in this game. And this is due to the weather system, which prioritizes certain Valkyrie typings as well as elemental typings. Anyways, let's just jump right into the investment guide. So first up, we have the new Badum Kiana. She is a Stardust Fire Valkyrie, which gives her some pretty good coverage against both Fire and Stardust bosses. We're seeing her typically paired up with Jovial Deception because they both do really well against Stardust bosses together. Her main gimmick is that she has very good AoE damage since she has a damage chair mechanic which spreads damage across all mobs after she marks them. She also has a new upcoming Astral Ring typing, so she's going to be a new support for that upcoming type. However, it is worth noting that her damage is actually quite average, so against neutral fire weathers, she'll be competing against Lantern and the Thankana Vicissitude. But of course, since she's the newest Valkyrie, she's going to have the most amount of boss coverage this patch. However, it is also worth noting that if you don't have the Teresa Astral Op, then you're going to fall behind other Badum Kiana players who do have the Teresa Astral Op, and that's because the Teresa Astral Op is incredibly broken for Law of Ascension characters. I think she's a great pull for new players overall, and she's definitely an S tier for 8.1, but I think she's gonna fall to A tier almost immediately after this version ends. The HoRb Human's Divine Key is actually quite good, especially for how cheap it is, but there are a number of conditions that need to be fulfilled. First of all, you need the HoRb Human, and I think most players should have her because she was good for free in the past, but if you don't have her, then obviously just don't even try to pull for this weapon. You're also gonna need thelema support since thelema is the only part 2 Valkyrie that can actually freeze mobs. And finally, Marissa Honkai argues that you should have a higher rank HoH to compete with other players that also have higher rank HoHs. And I think there's some truth to this statement, but also it's not necessarily always true. I've actually been able to get top 100 in Memorial Arena every time she showed up, as well as been able to promote to Nirvana in Abyss with only an S2 HoH. However, you could also argue that I just got really lucky, and I'm also playing in NA, which is a way less competitive server than C. So it's very possible that it's just way harder to promote in C if you don't have a high rank HoH. Now, as for how good she actually is, I think she's basically just an average Divine Key upgrade. We're going to see her perform really well on like 1 to 2 bosses for the next 3 to 4 patches or so, and then probably fall off. Currently, we're basically seeing her used mostly as a Law of Ascension support in Memorial Arena since there aren't enough Law of Ascension support Valkyries. So as a support, she isn't actually really an upgrade on any other Valkyrie, but she does have a new Astral Ring typing coming out, and we don't know how good she'll be as a support for that Astral Ring, so I'm not even going to speculate. HoH Divine Key is probably a mid-pull overall considering how many conditions she needs fulfilled. But for meta-wise, she's probably A tier just for 8.1. Rain Solaris is currently the strongest physical imaginary Valkyrie. We're also seeing her bosses really often in both Abyss and Memorial Arenas to this day. And although we see her compete with the HoRb trio sometimes with imaginary bosses, she's generally always better at this point. She also buffs Part 1 physical teams, but honestly, we have not really seen her as a support at all for Part 1 physical teams. More often than not, she's actually the DPS herself. And one of her best points is that she's generally a very strong shield breaker, which makes her a more desirable physical DPS than Jovial Deception for neutral physical weathers. However, just like any other Law of Ascension DPS, she is kind of reliant on the Teresa Astral Op to place top 100 in Arena. And of course, it's worth mentioning that she does have a teacher Astral Ring type that's not released yet, so she does have some future proof. Honestly, just anecdotally speaking, she is one of the most fun and also strongest Valkyries I have personally. She has really fast rotations compared to some Part 2 Valkyries like Lantern or Thelema, and since her role as an imaginary type shield breaker is quite niche, I don't think she'll be power crept that fast. Despite how much I'm glazing her, I still think she's just a good pull Valkyrie, because she's not the newest Valkyrie, unfortunately. And she's also an A tier for the current meta, possibly an S tier, but I want to be conservative. Sparkle has actually surprisingly had a pretty good comeback. I actually called her a pretty mid Valkyrie at her release, but I think she's been seeing a lot of usage recently because of her role as a Law of Ascension support. Her ult also lowers ult cooldowns for her teammate of choice, and which is really good for someone like Rain Solaris where her ultimate is actually very impactful. And there has been an uptick of Part 1 Fire Team usage thanks to her since she's actually a much more effective Part 1 Fire buffer than the other quote-unquote Part 1 Revivers like Trixis Imperative and Rain Solaris. Her biggest weakness though is just that she's not really great anywhere else. She's a pretty bad DPS overall, honestly speaking. And besides her Part 1 support role and her Law of Ascension support role, she's not a good buffer anywhere else. But if you need a quantum DPS, then maybe she's a worthy pickup. I think she's mid pull value overall since she is still very niche. And as for her meta ranking, I think she's an A tier right now due to the Law of Ascension dominance. Vita is by far one of the most versatile released Valkyries so far. As a DPS, she's pretty good, but her usage has definitely dropped off ever since Law of Ascension took over. However, her standout role is as a support because she can support basically every Astral Ring in the game so far. However, she isn't always the best in slot support for every team. For Wheel of Destiny teams, she loses to Senadina in most teams. And for Law of Ascension teams, she's worse for Rain Solaris but better for the Badum team. And she's also the best support for Shigihara's Imperative and Sparkle DPS, although both of them don't really see much usage right now. My only real issue with Vita right now is that she's definitely falling off, and I don't think she's gonna get a resurgence like Sparkle would since all her Astral Ring types have been released. I think she's somewhere between a good pull and a mid pull because she's still pretty good, but she is falling off. And meta-wise, she's definitely an A tier. Shigihara's Imperative is probably the strongest quantum DPS for part 2, and also can dual DPS with Lunar Vow in part 1 teams. However, Sparkle is still a very good substitute for her, as well as a Law of Ascension support, which makes her more valuable in my opinion. She definitely has her bosses where she top scores, but we just don't see them that much anymore unfortunately, not to mention that she can just be replaced by Sparkle if needed. As a support, she's basically in line with every other part 2 Valkyrie, so she doesn't really excel in supporting either. I also think people kind of overstate how good she was as a support for Lunar Vow. Honestly, Lunar Vow doesn't really need her that much to get top 100 in Memorial Arena. I think you should only consider pulling her if you want to hit Nirvana or you want to retain top 100 Memorial Arena consistently, but I don't think that's the average person watching this video either. She is my first no recommendation pull, as well as my first C tier Valkyrie. Jovial Deception is the premier Stardust physical Valkyrie. As a support, she has extremely fast rotations and supports both Rain Solaris and Badum Kiana. And she's also able to instantly trigger Stardust enemy Stardust explosions, which makes her very great at dealing with Stardust mobs. Although not as good as Badum DPS, you'll often use her alongside Badum Kiana anyways. Although her usage as a DPS will definitely drop off thanks to Badum Kiana's release, you're still going to see her just as often because she supports Badum Kiana for Stardust bosses. I personally think that she's the best value pull from the Carnival supply, although Marissa Honkai says that thelema is better, so do what you will with that information. Now I must mention that besides her role as a Law of Ascension support, she does not really see much use outside of that, so keep that in mind. So in terms of pull value, I think she's just mid, but meta-wise, currently she's A tier thanks to her support capability roles for Law of Ascension teams. Lantern is the premier ranged fire DPS for part 2 Valkyries. We're definitely starting to see Lantern fall off more and more each patch, and I don't think her usage rate will ever climb again. Even though she still has her top scores, we're seeing her bosses appear less and less every patch, not to mention that her bosses actually have decent alternatives to her. I know that some commenters have argued with me that Lantern's multi-hit gimmick is valuable, but we're seeing Vita take that spot now too instead. Lantern's main draw instead is how fast her rotations are, but I don't believe that this is good enough to make her worth pulling for anymore. So I'd put her as a don't pull, and in terms of meta ranking, I think she's either a B or C tier. She does see decent usage still compared to Shigihara's Imperative, but honestly, I think they're pretty close to each other. thelema is one of the older part 2 Valkyries that has actually fared pretty well, not to mention that she's the best in slot support for the new HoH Divine Key DPS. Once again, I'd like to reiterate that Marissa Honkai thinks that she's more valuable than Jovial Deception in the meta, and I disagree with him respectfully, but he's a better player than me, so take that how you will. One of her biggest strengths is that she has a time stop on her ultimate, which lets her freeze both the Abyss and Arena Clock. She's definitely seeing more usage this patch thanks to HoH's Divine Key release, since HoH is completely reliant on her. Her damage is also very high, but I do believe that she's gonna fall off soon since she's been out for one of the longest in part 2. So for now, thanks to HoH, I think she still maintains a mid-value pull, and for the meta, for 8.1 specifically, she will be an A tier. Senadina is still a pretty solid Valkyrie thanks to the fact that you don't have to switch into her to support with her, but my biggest issue with her is that she just has too many overlapping roles with Vita. Although Senna is still better than Vita for Wheel of Destiny teams, she's just not better enough to make her worth pulling on her own. Basically, her biggest issues is just that there's always someone that you can take over Senadina and get similar if not better results. So Senadina is unfortunately a don't pull, as well as probably a C tier character for this patch. There is not much to that Coralie. You can literally get her for free, and her gears for free, and she's the best in slot support for Vita right now at least. And if you're ever missing like a S rank support in any of your part 2 teams, then Coralie can take their place as an okay alternative. Helia, on the other hand, has been completely power cut by all supports. She's no longer best in slot on any team. And her weapon isn't even free, so I just wouldn't recommend building her unless you got her weapon for free somehow and you need her as a substitute for some other team. So Helia is a don't pull, and Coralie is free, so I'm not going to rank her. And for meta, Coralie is a C tier because Vita DPS needs her, while Helia is D tier. Her Sure Finality's usage is tied very closely to Vita DPS's. Although she's actually a pretty good role star support, other supports can fill her role at the same strength. Now speaking on the trio as a whole, they really only have one top score currently, but they do pretty well as substitute lineups for other bosses if you're missing the best teams for them. However, even for generic imaginary weathers, Rain Solaris seems to be better, so they are starting to lose their footing in the meta. However, this was to be expected since her Sure Finality's Divine Key was released 3 patches ago. I did predict that this would happen within 3 to 4 patches. So first of all, please do not pull anyone from the Herrscher trio, and only pull for the Kiana Divine Key if you have her or got her for free. Now for meta ranking, we're going to see the Herrscher trio's best boss return for this patch, so they'll get a C tier for the trio as a whole, and then Herrscher Divine Key is probably like a B tier. Lunar Vow is unfortunately falling off very hard, in fact much more rapidly than the start of part 2. The issue with a lot of the bosses now is that you basically just need an Astral Ring in order to beat them, and for the bosses that Lunar Vow was good at, they're just not showing up this patch. And the worst part is that a new bleed DPS is coming on 8.2. Although Lunar Vow is not strictly a bleed DPS, she is still competing with a new Valkyrie, which is not going to help her at all. Although her DPS is still very high, it's just very clear that her weathers and bosses are getting phased out, which is the bigger issue. She is in the don't pull category, as well as unfortunately D tier for the meta right now. The Senadina Vicissitude has many of the same issues as Lunar Vow as well. Although she still covers her weathers really well, it's just that they don't show up that much in the first place. Although Sparkle does help her, and we have been seeing a resurgence in her bosses, I think for this patch we're not seeing any of her bosses. So unfortunately, the Senadina Vicissitude is definitely a don't pull, as well as a D tier for this patch. To save some time, I'm going to rank both Eden and Cosmic Expression together, because they both fill the exact same role. Their usage rates are tied extremely close to Lunar Vow since they really only support her, but unfortunately they also compete with Crystal's Imperative. So we're seeing both Cosmic Expression and Eden compete with each other, but also compete with other Part 2 Valkyries. I have a feeling that their guilds will be free soon as well, and that the new bleed DPS will probably replace Lunar Vow in a lot of bosses unfortunately, so this is not a good pull anymore. The Herrscher of Rebirth is probably one of the biggest losers of Part 2. However, I'm putting her here just because I know that people really like her a lot, and unfortunately, I just think that she's probably considered a dead Valkyrie at this point, since we're seeing Part 2 physical Valkyries appear more and more. However, she might get a Divine Key. I'm kind of coping, but I do believe that will happen eventually. So here's my final 8.1 meta tier list. This is specifically for this version. Please keep that in mind. And this is also, of course, very biased and opinionated. So if you disagree with me, then leave a comment below. And please do watch through the video before you just skip here because there's so many nuances missing from this image alone. And here is my pull recommendations. I didn't put in CE and Eden and stuff just because I forgot to, but they're all in the don't pull category if it wasn't obvious enough. Once again, this pull recommendation is completely based on 8.1 specifically. We don't know if like maybe this new physical DPS coming out next patch could destroy Rain Solaris. We don't know. So please do keep in mind that this is very version dependent. Anyways, leave a like and subscribe if this helped you guys. I really appreciate all the views you guys give me because it gives me more money